I found this place thanks to a very detailed map. Just down there, according to the map, there used to be an iron gate. Behind it, to the southeast, lay the international settlement, which was neutral territory. Over on this side, to the northwest, was the North Shanghai Railway Station, which was in the Chinese sector and was one of the main targets of the Japanese attack. The Iron Gate stayed shut to prevent refugees from the Chinese city flooding into the foreign concessions. Then as now, refugees always face the same problems: where to find shelter, where the next meal will come from, and how to get money to buy food. The Japanese Marine Corps attacked the Chinese army stationed in Jiabei on Friday, August the 13th. The 813 battle, as it was known, came less than 6 weeks after the July the 7th incident in Beiping, which marked the start of the Sino-Japanese War.
By the thousands, Jiabei refugees mass outside the international settlement with everything they own. Only the pity of the white foreigners opens the gates to them, and only a small portion can be admitted.
As the sound of gunfire reverberated across Jiabei, the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank at 50 Ningbo Road was already open for business. It was just after 9 o'clock in the morning. Over there on the top floor of the bank, the employees gathered to watch. They could see the fires in Jiabei and hear the rumbling of heavy artillery. The fighting was clearly visible from the international settlement as well. And for fear that the wind blows sparks from the fires raging on the other side of Suzhou Creek, and that the buildings in the settlement catch fire as well, the settlement fire brigade directed water hoses onto the blaze. A strange sight. Foreigners who in theory were neutral, doing everything they could to keep the conflict at arm's length and avoid being drawn in. The company history of the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank records what happened that day. Soon the bank was crowded with customers, all coming to withdraw their money. Any kind of move takes money, whether it's to take refuge in the city during minor troubles or to flee to the countryside during major ones. In every case, people need money to find a place to settle. Wherever there is war, there'll be a bank run, and Chen Guangfu, the savings bank's general manager, understood that very well. His concern was not only for his own bank. He was chairman of the Shanghai Bankers Association, which represented 47 other financial institutions, and he knew that many of the banks in the Chinese sector were facing similar risks. How would they be able to cope with the consequences of the war? Less than 2 hours later, shortly before 11 a.m., TV Sung, who in the meantime had become chairman of the Bank of China, called Chen to tell him that the Finance Ministry had telegraphed urgent instructions to suspend business until further notice. The bank closed as ordered, while large crowds of people gathered outside hoping to withdraw their money. The war had taken much of the population by surprise. All that day, the Bankers Association met in emergency session to agree guidelines on withdrawals, notably the amount of funds each account holder would be permitted to take out. Two days later, the Ministry of Finance issued a ruling entitled Financial Stability Measures in Unusual Times, which laid down that not more than 5% of an account holder's funds might be withdrawn each week, with a ceiling of 150 yuan. And that applied only to current accounts. On time deposits, no withdrawals were permitted. Limiting withdrawals is something banks all over the world often do in wartime. The aim is both to remain solvent, in other words, not to run out of money, and also to limit the amount of cash in circulation so as not to stoke inflation. But being restricted to withdrawing just 5% of their accounts was far too little to meet the needs of the refugees. So the invisible hand of the market manifested itself again, this time through an explosion of pawnbroking. The population was desperate. 2 weeks after August the 13th, some 700,000 people in Shanghai were sleeping on the streets. Many had been forced to pawn their belongings to get money for food. But there was a catch. How could the pawn shops get the cash to pay people, since they too were limited by the banks in the amount of money they could withdraw? Once again, the Bankers Association stepped in. The Shanghai Pawnbrokers Union wrote to the Chamber of Commerce asking that an exception be made for its members and the withdrawal limits suspended. After that, the banks decided to make available large amounts of small denomination legal tender and fractional currency, which the pawn shops could use to pay their clients. On August the 17th, 4 days after the Finance Ministry's order to suspend activities, the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank in the Chinese city reopened, and the first depositors were permitted to withdraw funds from their accounts. On the street outside, there was pandemonium. But inside, as the company history noted, the staff worked calmly. This is where the Japanese troops landed in October 1937. It's in Jingshan district, 75 kilometers south of Shanghai. And you can pinpoint the exact spot in relation to those islands you can see on the horizon behind me. The Japanese headed north to Shanghai, where the fighting lasted 3 months. The Kuomintang withdrew, and the Japanese occupied the Chinese city. A month later, on December the 13th, the nationalist capital, Nanjing, fell too.
Nanking this morning has had its 28th raid. I am speaking to you just as the echoes of exploding bombs have died down. Death comes from the clear blue sky, just as it has come to thousands of our innocent people throughout the length and breadth of our land. This is in violation of all treaties and human rights.
12 days after Shanghai was occupied, on the evening of November the 25th, a French passenger ship stood by in the middle of the Huangpu River. TV Sung, the chairman of the Bank of China, and other leading financiers were smuggled on board and escaped secretly to Hong Kong. The Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank hired a British steamer to take key staff to Hankou. It left during the night of November the 30th, together with a couple of hundred refugees who'd stowed away on board. The bank staff spent the night sorting through their books, and according to the company history, were able to begin processing payments at the bank's Hankou branch as soon as it opened the following morning. In order, as the history puts it, that depositors can get their money as soon as possible. By the look of it, the banks in Shanghai coped rather well with wartime. I mean, is that a surprise to you? How do they manage it?
What we find from the files is that a protocol was established well before the war began. Please look at this document. Already in early 1936, they realized that there was going to be a war between China and Japan, and they began to plan for it and to establish a management system for wartime banking. So when it came, they were ready.
It's very early, 1936.
Yes.
It's impressive.
中日交涉，形势严重，我国不甘于属亡国之劝，故战事危机一触即发。 本行之准备应付事变，无时不在慎重周详之计划中。
So, as these archive documents show, more than 9 months before the war broke out, the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank had issued detailed instructions to its 30 or more branches throughout the country on how to respond to wartime conditions. To designate personnel to handle official seals, passwords, deeds, and other documents during emergencies, to seal up and secure materials that had to be left behind, and to maintain communications with head office. Chen Guangfu once said that the first duty of a bank in wartime was to do whatever was necessary to protect its clients' money, which had been earned, as he put it, through the efforts of the Chinese people. To do that, he maintained, required a good system, and that's what Chen and his colleagues in the Bankers Association tried to create. China's survival, they said, would depend on it. The Bund comprises some 20 buildings in a line running from north to south, divided in the middle by Nanjing Road, which goes from east to west. These two are so close together that when you walk between them, you can reach out and touch both sides. On the left was the Yokohama Specie Bank, one of the leading trade banks of Japan. On my right, the Bank of China, which has occupied this building since 1937. That was the year that marked the start of the Sino-Japanese War, which meant that for the Bank of China, the enemy was right next door. And alongside the military conflict, a financial struggle developed. On July the 7th, 1937, the Japanese army staged a provocation at Lugochao on the outskirts of Beiping, known to foreigners as the Marco Polo Bridge. It marked the start of years of bloody conflict throughout China, culminating in the Pacific War. When the fighting reached Shanghai in August, the United States, Britain, France, and other Western countries were still officially neutral, so the international settlement and the French concession remained outside the war zone. A local doctor recalling that time wrote that war on the battlefield was fought with weapons and caused the loss of human life. Away from the battlefield, it was fought with financial instruments and caused economic devastation. For Japan, one such instrument was the dissemination of counterfeit money, which it shipped in from Manchu Guo, the puppet state it had established in Manchuria, and distributed through a number of Chinese private banks doing business in the Wusong Road, Minhang Road, Xihuade and Miller Road areas. The Bankers Association issued a strong statement urging people to avoid the counterfeit money. A second Japanese ploy was to try to force the population to convert their money into military banknotes issued by the Japanese army. In wartime, to issue military currency isn't that unusual. Many other countries have done so for the use of their armies to prevent an outflow of their own money. But the Japanese went further. They used military notes to wage economic war. The Sichuan Road Bridge, just behind me, used to be an important crossing point from the international settlement to the Shanghai North Railway Station. The station was in the Chinese city, and if you wanted to buy a train ticket there, the Japanese insisted that you pay with their army money. So a black market developed here, beside the bridge, to exchange military notes for Chinese currency. The black market rate was that to buy 1 yuan in military currency, you had to pay 1 yuan 3 jiao in legal tender. The sellers had a profit margin of 5 to 7 fun, And in the early days of the war, the military notes had no serial numbers, so there was no way of telling how much army currency had been issued. As the Japanese attack progressed, the use of military notes was imposed on all the occupied areas. Before the war, most of the nationalist government's financial authorities had their headquarters in Shanghai. In August 1937, when the Japanese attacked, a coordination bureau was set up by the state-owned banks and the trust and postal systems to put their credit and loan business on a war footing. After the city was occupied in November, these agencies were relocated to the interior. But the Shanghai Bankers Association continued to play an important role in resisting the occupying forces' directives.
您看，这是当时上海银行工会和这个国民政府它的这个交流的函电。南京国民政府呢，由于这个首都的失守，所以他们已经从汉口再一直迁到了重庆。这些函电里边呢，它所反映的意思呢，就是要求银行工会呢是拒绝和日本人以及北方的傀儡政府合作，同时呢要防止这个就是北方的伪币在上海市场的流通。那么当时留守在上海的银行工会的这些负责人呢，是非常积极地执行了这个重庆方面的指令。那么他们是利用租界呢来对抗日本人。
So the settlement must have been pretty important to the nationalists in the early years of the war. I mean, it was also the only channel open between Shanghai and the outside world, and that must have been extremely useful for them.
对您说的这个呢，我认为是很有道理的，因为在1941年12月太平洋战争爆发之前呢，上海呢是中国唯一一个口岸可以和西方进行贸易的往来，而且呢，国民政府呢也认为这个上海这样一个特殊的这个，特别是租界的存在，这样特殊的一个地位的话呢，是有利于接收对外的援助。那么对于抗日战争呢，它就是说我们持续下去呢是非常有积极意义的。
Even the Chinese currency, the legal tender, had to be brought in through the international settlement. Previously, it had been ordered direct through specialist printing houses abroad. But with the Japanese blockading the coast, the Bank of China had to ask HSBC and the Standard Chartered Bank to import banknotes on its behalf. As though that weren't difficult enough, matters were soon complicated still further because of a split in the nationalist ranks. In March 1940, the Kuomintang's nominal vice president and former rival to Chiang Kai-shek, Wang Jingwei, defected to Japan and established himself in Nanjing at the head of a Japanese-backed government, which in due course announced the creation of its own monetary authority, the so-called Central Reserve Bank. In January 1941, Wang's bank took over the Bank of China building on the Bund, which was declared to be the Reserve Bank's Shanghai branch, and began issuing yet another currency, Central Reserve notes, which Wang and his Japanese patrons demanded should replace the nationalists' old legal tender. For the public at large, and for bank employees, life was about to become even more difficult.
这里啊，是中国银行职工的一个宿舍区。抗战前呢，它有花园，有俱乐部，有学校，有诊所，还有呢理发店、图书馆，甚至餐厅，包括运动场。这是中国啊当时最早有社区概念的一个住宅区。
Before the war, the bank staff had a pretty good life here.
对啊，当时生活在这里的人呢，生活是非常好的。可是呢，战争啊，改变了一切。
How did they react to the issuance of these Central Reserve notes by Wang Jingwei's government? Because after all, that meant they were really working for the Japanese.
对，这就是我为什么要带你到这里来的一个原因。当时呢，为了抵制那个中储券，就在这个中航别业里，有128个员工遭到了绑架。
When did that happen?
那是在1941年的3月份。当时啊，为了这个针对这个银行方面呢，已经发生了多起的枪杀案件。然后这里呢，128个这个员工呢，后来被鉴别以后，有5个人不是中航的，把他放掉了，其他的人呢，就抓了关了整整有半个多月。后来经过多方营救， 才得到了这个释放。但是呢，还有2位重要的银行的这个主任这一级的官员啊，被枪杀了。
Despite the pressure, resistance continued. The international settlement, isolated though it was, continued to play its role. And the power of the market proved remarkably resilient there. The growing numbers of refugees caused house prices to rise. Capital flowed into the settlement from the occupied areas, both to promote the recovery of the manufacturing sector and for speculation on the foreign exchange and stock markets. As so often in wartime, amid the misery, there was hedonism. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, this artificial interlude came to an end. The foreign concessions were overrun, the British and American banks were seized as enemy property. At HSBC's head office at number 12 the Bund, the Japanese flag replaced the Union Jack. Financial activity came to a standstill. Foreigners were interned in Japanese-run camps. 3 more long years would pass before the anti-Japanese war would come to an end.
This isn't the mansion of some millionaire banker. In 1946, it was the Shanghai office of Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Communist Party's vice chairman and its chief representative in talks with the nationalists on a possible power-sharing agreement. The talks ended inconclusively. Once the war was over, the alliance the two parties had forged for their common struggle against Japan broke down. A new war was brewing, this time between them. And with it, turbulence in China's financial markets on a scale never seen before. The nationalists would be defeated, but only after China had suffered ruinous inflation. And it would then be left to the Chinese communists to start the task of reconstruction.
The head of the nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek, returned to Shanghai from Chongqing for the first time in 9 years. 200,000 people gathered at the racecourse to welcome him and to take part in a victory rally. In his speech, Chiang compared the gathering to a family reunion. He wanted the nation to pull in its belt and devote the next 8 years to rebuilding after the war. But actions speak louder than words. The people whom he was addressing had other things on their minds: the devaluation of the currency and uncontrolled price rises. Ordinary citizens found it harder and harder to get through to the end of the month. In fact, the nationalist government had missed an opportunity to restore a sound currency system after the Japanese defeat.
In 1937, just before the war began, the total amount of legal tender in circulation was 1.4 billion yuan. 8 years later, that figure had ballooned to 570 billion. The reason was simple. The war had required huge amounts of military spending at a time when tax revenues were going through the floor. The only way to make up the shortfall was to print money, which caused inflation to soar and made the currency lose much of its value. In wartime, there was no choice. It was a matter of national survival. But now that the war was over, why not reduce spending and get the country's finances back on a sound basis?
That question was put to the nationalist finance minister Yu Hongjun by Zhu Qi, the ministry official who'd warned 10 years earlier of the dangers of abandoning the silver standard. The minister's reply was categorical. Now is not the time to save, he said. This is the time to spend. The nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party, while the two sides talked peace, Chiang Kai-shek was preparing for the war, which both knew was bound to follow. Wars cost money, so Chiang was printing yet more banknotes, even as his government struggled to control the previous wave of inflation. To try to square this circle, he brought back TV Sung, the former finance minister who now headed the executive yuan. The central bank's reserves amounted to 4 million ounces of gold, with another 5 million ounces in loans, plus $900 million in cash, with a further 2 billion in promissory notes. If the reserves were sold, Sung reasoned, the excess legal tender would be absorbed and prices would start falling again. In March 1946, the executive yuan followed his advice, approving a resumption of foreign exchange dealing and the selling off of China's gold.
So 这个鱼很好吃的，
黄鱼，
黄鱼新鲜，红烧可以，清蒸可以，什么都可以，到处啊都可以。
不错，不错。This is where they used to sell large yellow croakers. And no, they're not fish. It's what people in the Republican period used to call standard gold bars, each weighing 10 liang. That's about 370 grams. In September 1947, a large yellow croaker was worth 2,000 yuan in legal tender, 300 yuan less than it had been 6 months earlier, which suggested that TV Sung's stabilization measures were working. A month later, however, the gold price started climbing again. As the fighting intensified, Chiang Kai-shek's commanders and military governors spent less and less time on the battlefield and more transferring their assets into gold and US dollars.
The central bank chartered an aircraft to deliver cash all over the country to pay military expenses. After the army officers received huge sums in cash, they first rushed to purchase gold and dollar bills, and then chartered another plane to go back to Shanghai to speculate in foreign currency.
Over the next 12 months, the collapse of the legal tender became irreversible. Zhu Qi, the finance ministry official who'd criticized Yu Hongjun, wrote in his diary, "On September the 26th, 1947, I paid 17,000 yuan for a haircut. On August the 23rd, 1948, I paid 2.4 million. That would be the last time that Zhu Qi recorded the purchasing power of legal tender. For that week, the currency ceased to exist. They were replaced by these so-called gold yuan notes, which were supposed to be backed by the gold reserves the government claimed to hold, and which bore the portrait of Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists announced that they'd issued 2 billion yuan in gold notes, at 4.6 yuan to the US dollar, with 200 yuan equivalent to 1 liang of gold. But the collapse of the legal tender was still fresh in people's memories, and there was widespread skepticism about the new currency, justifiably as it turned out. In the fine print of the new law, it was stipulated that all gold, silver coins and foreign currency, and coins held by individuals and institutions shall be handed over to the National Bank within a limited period of time and converted to gold yuan notes. In other words, there would be a repeat of the compulsory silver purchase of 1933, when the nationalists had introduced silver dollars, only to abandon them 2 years later. This time, the market fought back. The silver dollar, which had been withdrawn from circulation and was supposed to have lost its value as a currency, made a spectacular comeback. Here, in the basement of the old stock exchange building at number 422 Hanko Road, touts stored hundreds of thousands of dollars which they bought and sold on the black market. At a time when paper money was totally discredited, people thought gold and silver were more likely to hold their value.
5月24日，人民解放军的前卫部队攻入上海市区。
When the Communist forces took Shanghai on May the 27th, 1949, the CCP found itself confronted with the immense task of rebuilding the financial system. Its initial strategy of selling silver dollars in order to stabilize prices failed dismally, or as the Chinese saying puts it, like a clay ox entering the sea. So the Shanghai Military Control Commission took strong measures to crack down on the black market and stop all private trade in silver dollars and foreign currency. In its place, the new authorities introduced a barter system. Bulk grain was exchanged for bulk cotton. Without any currency changing hands, the cotton was sent to the mill owners and the factories started working again. The barter system was one way of dealing with Shanghai's economic problems after the nationalist defeat, but the communists also had another idea: to back their new currency, the renminbi, not with gold and silver, but with commodities. Parity for the renminbi was defined as equivalent to the value of 1 litre of hulled rice, 1 square foot of 12-pound dragon head cotton cloth, 1 liang of cooking oil, and 1 jin of coke for heating stoves. This basket of commodities would be adjusted by the government to keep pace with inflation and ensure that the currency's purchasing power was maintained. The system proved successful. The renminbi withstood the financial turbulence of the early years after the communist victory and established itself as China's national currency, which the country still uses today. "1949 brought enormous changes to China, and finance was no exception. The transition to a planned economy meant that the new central bank, the People's Bank of China, took over all the functions that the banking system had exercised before. And then, in 1978, it all changed yet again, and even more in the 1990s, when it was decided that Shanghai should become once again China's main financial center, initially for domestic transactions, and soon afterwards, internationally. When I first visited Shanghai in 1977, I stayed at the Peace Hotel. It was then one of the city's tallest buildings with its signature green and red roof, and was one of the very few places in Shanghai which was permitted to accommodate foreigners. In those days, the Bund was full of administrative offices. The former HSBC building was the seat of the municipal government. In the 1990s, that started to change. The municipal government moved out first, others followed, often with a good deal of reluctance, until by the turn of the century, the Bund was once again what it had been 50 years earlier, the city's financial centre. That same decade, the first skyscrapers started rising in Pudong, in an area where I used to see just fields and run-down warehouses along the river. Lujiazui was created as a new financial centre. Today, it's changing yet again. 120 square kilometres have been set aside for a pilot free trade zone extending eastward from Shanghai to the coast. And it's fair to ask, where will all these changes lead? What will the future bring this city? And what will China be like after another 50 years have passed?
In the opening decades of the 21st century, Shanghai has become an economic and financial hub for both Northeast and Southeast Asia. The China Sea has started playing the kind of role in regional trade that the Mediterranean played in Europe at the time of the Roman Empire. If one looks at the major cities of the region, which spread out in a great arc from Seoul to Jakarta, Shanghai lies towards the center. For Shanghai, the Belt and Road Initiative represents an historic opportunity. It's at the eastern end of China's new maritime Silk Road, linking Asia with Europe and Africa, and of the economic belt being built through Central Asia across Russia and Eastern Europe. To play its role fully, Shanghai needs financial and trade rules which accord with its strategic location. 100 years ago, such rules were dictated by the West. But in today's multipolar world, China has its say too. A key aim for the Chinese government is to make Shanghai a major financial center, not just for China, but internationally. To that end, between the Huangpu River and the coast of the East China Sea, a special area has been set aside as an experimental free trade zone. Mindful of historical sensitivities about extraterritoriality, when the foreigners in the 19th century concessions could do as they wished, ignoring Chinese laws, it specified that the zone is within the territory of China, but outside national customs control. There are bonded areas where goods can be brought in and out without customs formalities, warehouses for imports which go direct to the Chinese market, a high-tech and an export processing park, and an international financial center with offices of the world's major banks, stock exchanges, clearing houses, interbank centers, and futures exchanges. When complete, it will provide an integrated system of financial institutions capable of serving the whole of East Asia. The zone has two distinct functions. For imports into China, it reduces transit times. For instance, the wine in this warehouse will get through customs clearance and inspections in less than half the time it used to take. And secondly, it facilitates international financial operations and cross-border transactions, which makes life easier for foreign firms based here and for the Chinese companies that work with them. Registration procedures for companies operating in the free trade zone are greatly simplified. There's much less paperwork than in the rest of China. In fact, the policy can be summed up as everything that's not forbidden is allowed. For multinational corporations and small companies alike, one of the main advantages of the zone is that they can open what's called an FT, a free trade account. And that's what these people behind me are queuing up to do. It's called here a 6-star policy, meaning that it's one better than 5 stars. And for groups like Alstom, the French company which has been operating here for 2 years, it has brought important benefits. Alstom is one of the world's leading manufacturers of rail and tramway systems. It's operated in China since the 1950s, but in view of the rapid growth of the transportation sector, it's recently stepped up its activities in the Chinese market.
40% of our business in China involves international transactions and foreign currency exchange. So it is critical for us to find out an efficient and effective cross-border treasury method.
How did you do that?
By entering into free trade zone, we're going to have a free trade account.
How does that work?
Funds move freely between us and our affiliated companies in overseas. Setting up a free trade account allows us to meet financial needs more easily. Alstom now can set up a RMB two-way cross-border cash pool, which is efficient and flexible in terms of fund circulation. The free trade account gives Alstom the flexibility to decide the final settlement of the foreign currency with our own planning and judgment of the market.
This system encourages foreign companies to invest in China because it reduces their operating costs. And in the longer term, it will promote the internationalization of the renminbi as a fully convertible currency. If you look back over the past century, you find the evolution of China's currency has always mirrored. First, the legal tender of the 1930s, then gold yuan notes and renminbi.
The expansion of the SDR basket is a historical milestone for the SDR, for the fund, but more importantly for China and for the international monetary system.
The last big change took place on October 1st, 2016, when the renminbi was formally incorporated into the International Monetary Fund's basket of currencies for special drawing rights. By then, it was the world's third-ranking currency for international settlements after the dollar and the euro, and its use in special drawing rights was a further significant step towards its internationalization, enhancing the competitiveness of China's economy. But it's not all about global trade and giant multinational corporations. Here in Tianzifang, you get a glimpse of another side of Shanghai. The countless startups and small companies, micro-businesses in many cases, which reflect the entrepreneurial spirit and sometimes off-the-wall creativity of young designers and businessmen. Life isn't always easy for these small enterprises. They've had problems with high cost and the difficulty of obtaining bank loans to expand their businesses because the credit system doesn't work as it should. The government responded with tax cuts, reduced administrative fees, and an easing of credit. To apply the new policy, it appointed the now renamed Shanghai Banking Association. The Banking Association is the successor to the old Shanghai Bankers Association, which was established almost 100 years ago, and it plays a similar role, acting as a bridge between the banks and government regulators. Only nowadays, it's digitalized. Small businesses or individual entrepreneurs can type in the amount of the loan they're seeking, in this case 1 million renminbi, and search for banks which may be able to help them. Another link gives each bank's details and a link through which they can submit a loan application. What is this for?
Yeah, the online system, yes, we provide 370 credit products.
Do you share information with other organizations?
Yes, we share the information with the city's tax bureau.
And what does that help you do?
It will minimize the credit risks.
In a fair and just society, the right to credit is important. That's the idea behind what the United Nations calls an inclusive financial system, meaning that the poor as well as the rich should be entitled to loans and credit. The Banking Association's online platform is one way Shanghai is trying to tackle that. Mao Zedong once wrote of the years passing in the blink of an eye. After 1949, and especially since the late 1970s under the policy of reform and opening up, China has developed from a poor and backward country into an economic powerhouse far too important for the rest of us to ignore. The results have been spectacular and have been felt in every corner of the world. The constant theme of this series of programs has been the idea that finance is a key factor shaping a nation's future. Today, China understands better the importance of the financial sector for the economy and for society at large, and the need to put it on a sound basis. For the West, this is a crucial issue. In the decades ahead, China's influence on global finance will be immense. Indeed, I would say, judging from experience, it will be comparable to that which the reform program has had on the global economy.